And one of the reasons I think the Turks were asked to come in was that they're not engaged right now in any way against the Russians. As a result, they have essentially a surplus of capability. They're soldiers who are not otherwise engaged in fighting, and they have military power that they can use on behalf of NATO. That's why I think they're there. It's not because someone had some sinister idea to put Muslim Turks into Kosovo. I think it's looked like the only people who can do this right now, who are ready and could send forces, are the Turks. Everybody else is overwhelmed by the Ukraine business. Sir, you mentioned the partition of Kosovo that was discussed in the 1990s. Do you think that is possible? The bottom line, especially now linking that to Ukraine. Some of us think that the reason why the globalist elites, let's say, would be interested in starting another conflict in the Balkans is precisely because Ukraine is not going well for them, and the Balkans are always ripe for some of these sinister games. But partitioning Kosovo, Serbs will not accept that, especially the Serbian Orthodox Church, which owns much of the territory of Kosovo. Monasteries and churches there have stood there for centuries. What would be the bottom line? And then you link that Ukraine. Maybe another partition, and there have been a lot of conversations about the double standards between Kosovo and Crimea. For example, we're screaming about the sovereignty of Ukrainian borders. Why wasn't anybody screaming about the sovereignty of Serbian borders? Well, I think I've already answered. If no one is screaming about Serbian sovereignty in any form, that's because the Clinton administration developed this visceral dislike of it and decided to demonize the Serbs. What happens in Kosovo is an extension of what began in Bosnia. I mean, we could go back over that history. That would take us some time to cover all the details. But I was party to that. I watched it. And even though people at the time in Bosnia looked at Tudjman and weren't impressed with him, and many of them did not necessarily like Mr. Izetbegovic, and for various reasons Izetbegovic was given a pass, and there are still people in Washington who are strongly aligned with Bosnia and Kosovo. And at the same time, Tudjman was hammered into the line at the time by Kohl, who was the Chancellor of Germany. So then we tried to get the Russians to quote-unquote hammering the Serbs into line. Didn't work. Well, when it came to Kosovo, it was under great pressure and difficulties at home that the Russians had at the time, in 1999, that they finally pulled out from under Milosevic and left him hanging during the air campaign. I mean, I think the bottom line is as follows. If you go back over the last 500 in years of European history, one of two things happens. A division of territory is arrived at by someone in power. In other words, the various representatives sit down and say, all right, if we don't come up with a partition of some kind, we're going to have another war. And several people would sit around the table, and I'm talking about going back to Metropolitan Bismarck and Disneyland. This is not a permanent solution for this partition, but it's the best that we can do right now, and it'll buy us some time. The Congress of Vienna bought time for Europeans, but it was not popular with many. Many people go back and remember that while the Europeans were dividing up things, the great powers served. We were still fighting the Turks, and, no one paid any attention to the skull towers of Niš. Yes, I mean, they didn't know about it, but people said, look, we know. I can't turn that on right now. Subsequently, it changes, it takes time. And so I think there may be a willingness to look at some solution that is imperfect for the reasons that you've just outlined, and that may result in a partition of some kind, and then guarantees that the property that belongs to the Orthodox Christian Church will not be harmed, will not be desecrated, and will be treated as essentially international monuments to history. I mean, some of those have been in Kosovo, and some of those churches go back to the 18th century and earlier. So I mean, this is the beginning of what we think of today in the world of Christianity. I think that could be done, but what I'm trying to say is that may present itself. There may be an appetite for that and a willingness to do that to serve leadership. Then one has to think through. This is not everything we want. We're only going to get 75% of it. We're not going to get the other 25%. We're only going to get 70, not the other 30. Well, do you accept that on the understanding that at some future point in time, there may be an opportunity to revisit it? Or do you refuse it? And I don't know what the right answer is. This is something that has to be carefully considered by the Serbs. Not a pleasant experience, and everyone in Yugoslavia knows that everyone went to hell back in the 90s. Sure, they need to recall that. And then you have us. We got involved in a big way, as we were talking earlier about. These B-1B bombers flying over Bosnia are essentially some sort of signal to the Serbian state that we're still here and we can still bomb you, which I think is appalling because most of us at the time thought that was a disgrace anyway. I've talked before about that. I didn't know very many people in Europe who thought that you knew NATO existed to create a new war in Europe, which is ultimately what we did. So the bottom line is that there are no perfect solutions right now, but there may be an interim one. And everyone needs to look carefully at that. Our friend that's sitting in Pristina feels that he has a lot of wind behind him may discover that in a couple of years, the wind is completely gone and no one is going to particularly give a damn anymore about what he does or doesn't want. And by the way, there are lots of people who notice lots of weapons that have been shipped to Ukraine that show up in Kosovo and then are moved elsewhere into the hands of people that we in the West would not want to arm. So again, he's got to rethink what he's doing right now. He's got backing. There's no question about it. It may not last, but he doesn't necessarily have the backing that he wants for a military confrontation because everyone's eyes are fixed on that point. Ukraine is interesting, and you served under President Trump, and we all remember that. The botched pullout from Afghanistan during the Biden administration now. Many people make similar comments. Wait until the Americans leave Kosovo. And at some point that will come to an end. We simply, as Americans, cannot sustain this coast of ours anymore. May find themselves in a tricky situation, including our friend Baldwin Curdy anyway. I wanted to move to Ukraine and overnight, I believe, or yesterday, on Dnipro was taken out, or a portion of that dam. What do you make of it? Who did it? Who benefits? Well, there are several stories right now. The Ukrainians, of course, have said, oh, the Russians did this, and there's not much reason to believe that because the Russians could have done it a long time ago but didn't want to do it because it turned a great deal of the area into Hassan. Into marsh, it's not beneficial. And remember, the Russians have always conducted operations with a view to what things look like when they end. That's something we never consider very carefully, but the Russians have looked at that, so they have been trying to avoid what they would call unnecessary collateral damage. Where it's unavoidable, they'll do it, but that was never really in the plan. Ukrainians are accused by the Russians of doing it well. If that's true, effects are as follows. You end up with a portion of the Russian defense flooded on the east side of the Dnieper River. There's no question about that. That help Ukraine well. If you're looking at the length of the defensive line that the Russians have built, which was almost 900 miles, shortens that line a little bit. But when you start shortening the defensive line, which doesn't favor the Ukrainians. In other words, that reduces the amount of territory to which the Russians need to respond in the event of a Ukrainian attack. Then there's a third story. And the third story is that one of the turbos inside the dam's operation blew up, and that comes from someone on the ground who is a Russian who was familiar with the dam. And if that's true, then the whole thing was probably accidental. But again, if it's accidental, it doesn't help Ukraine at all. It makes it tougher for them to do their job, but the Russians probably do benefit since they have less to defend now. Not that I think the Russians are in any danger. And if you go back and look at what happened over the last 3 days, we've had these so-called probing attacks from the Ukrainian side. Almost 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been lost, 54 tanks, 140 armored fighting vehicles, numerous trucks, 2 helicopters, several Ukrainian aircraft, etc. Probing attacks into Russian defenses were disasters. Russian losses are almost negligible. The point of being irrelevant. So the bottom line is, at this stage, I would not attach too much significance to it except to look at it as probably reducing options for the Ukrainians are not improving. They understand us here in the United States, but within the entire Western geopolitical construct, we don't seem to pursue any kind of peace plan. There certainly is a war plan, and we know war is a racket. We understand that billions of dollars have been going to Ukraine, most of it ending up back here in some of our politicians' pockets. We have seen weapons all of a sudden in the hands of Mexican cartels. What is our bottom line?